All right, let's get this thing started. So thank you so much to everybody for coming out tonight for the inaugural React Native Bay Area meetup. Thank you. We're excited, so excited that you're all here tonight. It's a bigger turnout than we were even really imagining. So excited to see all the enthusiasm around React Native and building more of a community around around React Native and mobile application development. So to set a bit of context for this evening, so I'm Derek Edwards, and I'm moderator for tonight. I'm part of the Talio team, co-founder and managing partner, and we've worked closely with companies, or had the fortune to work with companies around the Bay Area to help build out curriculum, and most recently getting into building curriculum around React and React Native. And as part of that, we've had an opportunity to see firsthand just some of the both the benefits as well as some of the challenges that come with React Native and starting to use it in production. And we decided that as being part of the community and building out education and mentoring around these different frameworks, that it was really on us to transform it not only from an internal facing conversation, but really a public conversation to talk about some of the benefits, some of the challenges, and some of the things that have been learned along the way, so that people aren't going into it blind, and everybody can benefit from understanding how to best utilize things like React Native in a production setting. So with that, over the last few months, we've been working closely with some of our partners to put together a panel for this inaugural event, and I think that everybody will really get a lot out of what everyone on the panel has to say tonight. And so with that said, I know that we want this to be an ongoing thing, not just a one-off event. So if the idea behind having more open conversations around React Native resonates with folks here tonight, we do want to build out more of an organizing committee going forward. And so anybody who's particularly interested in being a part of that, certainly come and grab myself or one of the team members wearing the React training shirt, and we'd love to talk with you about setting that up for the future. So with that out of the way, I want to do a quick shout out to our sponsors for tonight. First and foremost, really want to thank PayPal for hosting us here, letting us use the wonderful town hall building. And likewise providing a lot of support along the way for putting together this event. Also want to thank Walmart Labs for being great partners in building out and learning more about React Native ourselves and really getting immersed in the community. They've done a lot to really get us plugged in and helping to make this happen as well. Likewise, want to put a shout out for Likewise, want to put a shout out there for Facebook, because without their ongoing support for React Native and continuing to invest resources into building out that framework and really build the community around it, none of us would be here tonight. So quick shout out for them as well. And lastly, just a final shout out to the rest of the Talio team, my team here tonight. They've put in a lot of work in helping to put together this event as well. And we're so glad to be a part of this. So, all right. So with that, I think it'd be good for each of us. I know some of these faces are recognizable to folks who've seen them at other conferences, but I think it'd be good to get to know our panelists a little bit better. So I'd like to start, first with Ram on my right. Ram joins us from the Facebook React Native core team. And Ram, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to be here?
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. As Derek said, my name is Ram, and I'm new to the Bay Area. I'm a software engineer at Facebook on the React Native core team, and one of the responsibilities of my job is to ensure that React Native is successful in open source. What that means is talking to developers like you and ensuring that any issues that you guys have with React Native is taken care of. So please do feel free to come talk to me if you have any issues with React Native, and I'd be more than happy to help. And I said I was new to the Bay Area. That was because before this, I was at this company up in Seattle. You must have heard of it. It's called Microsoft. And I used to be a program manager on this service called Code Push. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Code Push, but that's the service that I was running. And Code Push eventually became Mobile Center, which is now called App Center, a DevOps solution for React Native. So I used to be running that team. Apart from that, I'm also a member, a committer and a PMC member in Apache Cordova or Ionic. And I used to work on the Xamarin team. So I've been doing hybrid apps for like almost forever.
No, so just about everybody has probably used some of your code at some point or another.
I'm sorry.
All right. Well, next on the line is Derek Anderson from the PayPal team, as part of the mobile product team. And
Thank you. Yeah. So, for those of you that don't work with me, I work on checkout products, and so if you've checked out with PayPal, I'm also sorry because you've seen my code as well. But we have been working with React Native for the last couple years in checkout, experimenting with it in different ways along the route of trying to ship a product with it. So I'm excited to share that journey with you guys.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Derek. Next on the line, we have Matt Bresnan joining us from the Walmart Labs carton checkout team. And Matt, why don't you share a little bit about kind of your role at Walmart Labs and what brings you here tonight?
Sure. As he said, I work on the carton checkout team at Walmart Labs. I'm one of the lead engineers there, developing and then maintaining the carton checkout, and also promoting the use of React Native within the company. And through the efforts, the successes that we had with React Native on the carton checkout team, we now have around 8 different sub-applications within our application using React Native. So it's been such a great success, and that's about all I had.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're excited to learn more about that. All right, last and certainly not least is Richard, also joining us from the Walmart Labs team, specifically helping to lead up Electrode Native. So, Richard, if you would share a little bit about your role.
I've been 5 years at PayPal, so half of my team is from PayPal. So, thank you, PayPal. Our checkout is better than yours. So my team is not using React Native in a direct way. Our mission was more to big company have a lot of investment already in mobile and bring React Native. Of course, we could not just throw away all the stuff and just start fresh with React Native. We had to allow a path for people to be able to easily integrate features written in React Native into our either Walmart app or grocery app or jet.com app. So we have a bunch of different internal org, and we're trying to create a platform that allowed for simple integration. And when I say simple integration, meaning we have a bunch of repo all over the place. We've defined ways of formalizing a contract between JavaScript engineer and native engineer. We do a lot of code generation to simplify the process. We support highly primitive types. So our work has been open source last September. It's called Electrode.io. We also have an OTA server to bounce back on the code push thing. Code push is the tool to push. The server is there to propagate the bundle. So if tonight I speak, I will be more talking about how we enable an ecosystem for integrating the two worlds.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Richard.
Walmart!
All right, so just to go for a bit of our format for this evening, we're going to have things broken down into 5 major themes. First of all, talking about really how you're using React Native in production today. So, what properties, where it's used, and talking a little bit about the nature of how you're using it. we'll dive into, secondly, why you chose React Native, some of the decisions that went into that, followed up with challenges adopting the framework. So talking about some of the earlier days and what led to the way that you ended up approaching some of these integrations. After that, talking a little bit about using React Native really at scale. So any issues that came up more from a production setting, and finally kind of closing out with a discussion around some of the solutions that have been built along the way. After that, we'll touch on a Q&A session, so you, the audience, will have an opportunity to pose any burning questions you have, and then we'll have an opportunity to go back to mingling and finishing off whatever pizza is left over. So with that, I guess let's go ahead and dive into some of our discussion around how you're using React Native in production today. And I thought I would kick it off by posing the question to Derek, as far as how it's used today at PayPal.
So at PayPal, we are using it in a couple different uses right now. For full-blown apps, which it probably is definitely positioned to be used well, we have rolled a couple like Talio top-off apps, and so those are really easy to be rebranded using React Native. So I would say that there were still not great adoption at using it, but that was one of our big uses, and we'll get into that in the next topic. And then we're also trying to use it as a third-party SDK. And we've run into many challenges using it in that fashion, but those are two of the big uses. So we're using it in full-blown apps, and then also trying to ship a third-party SDK with it, iOS and Android. So we haven't investigated any of the, I know Microsoft just came out with Microsoft React Native, and a couple other platforms as well.
Okay, great. And so as far as how you're using it today, what other, obviously React Native on its own is not, doesn't necessarily give you the full picture, the full platform. So what other kinds of components kind of come into play?
Absolutely. So especially on like the Talio app, we found that a lot of the developers there were wrapping current native controls to kind of get a feel around just doing the ecosystem itself. So even though there may have been a node module that could have done what they needed, the discovery for those modules is probably still very low. So in terms of what's missing, we even find that just regular mock-ups of doing bridge modules of things that might have already existed in the wild are happening. At the same time, talking, especially with code push and stuff, we knowing Walmart has this open source, we've also done something similar where we had to go and stand up like a code push just because that was not a part of React Native, so we had to reach outside of the ecosystem to do it. But in terms of what's in the ecosystem, we rarely find that we probably need to go outside of it to get a finished feature or a product. It's always an edge case that forces us to get something that's not within the ecosystem.
Okay, great. So I guess posing kind of a similar question to Ram, do you mind sharing a little bit about kind of the current primary use cases for React Native within Facebook?
So I can give you the Facebook side of the answer and also the Microsoft side of the answer if you're interested. But as far as Facebook is concerned, a lot of people have the misconception that React Native is used only in the side apps. That's not true anymore. How many of you have the Facebook app installed? A good number. The React Native is running in there. In fact, one of the most popular views on the Facebook app is actually built using React Native. So React Native runs on the Facebook app itself. Apart from them, there are a ton of individual apps. We've been talking about the Ads Manager app that's completely written in React Native end-to-end. There are a bunch of internal apps that are also completely written with React Native end-to-end. So I think the general story, as far as Facebook is concerned, given that React Native started at Facebook, is that React Native is used not only as standalone apps, but also apps that were written in native, but then we had React Native screens embedded, primarily because we wanted to get done things fast, right? Like we didn't want to write iOS and Objective-C, we wanted to get it done fast. Now the Microsoft side of the answer is also very interesting. Though I was not involved in the projects myself because I was primarily doing dev tools, you might have heard of this library called React XP, which is like a way to write React code that runs on the web, iOS, Android, and Windows. This was something that was pioneered by the Skype folks, and the Skype client is written using React Native. So I think the allure or the thing that people like about the whole React story is you write it once or define your components, and then it can scale across platforms. And it doesn't have to be a standalone app. It can be also integrated into existing apps. So I think that's basically the usage that we have.
So when you talk about, you mentioned that within the Facebook app, for example, that there's one main view that utilizes
It's
React
not just
Native.
one, but one of the most. There are probably like 17 or 18 surfaces. I can. I mean, it's so if you look at the tabs at the bottom, there's Marketplace. That's fully React Native. There is your profile that's React Native. There is Crisis that's React Native. There are a ton of, I can't even remember all the surfaces.
So for anything that wasn't React Native, was it completely iOS or Android native at that point, or was it sort of a hybrid?
It was iOS and Android. A bunch of them were using Litho and Component Kit, if you have heard of Litho and Component Kit. Litho is basically an Android flavor of React, if you may want to call it that. I'm probably not doing justice to Litho and Component Kit, but there's like Litho, Component Kit, React Native, and plain good old native.
Okay, thank you. Matt, how about you tell us a little bit about how it's utilized within the cart and checkout setting at Walmart?
Sure. So all of our uses currently are in our customer-facing applications. Well, just the main Walmart application. So currently we have cart and checkout. As we said, those are core sections of the app. You're required to go to those sections if you want to check out. But we also have a lot of our features as well. So we have like our photo app is now in React Native. We have a new list app, which is now in React Native. And we also do, sometimes the seasonal features, like we have a back to school app, which is done in React Native. React Native just kind of allows us to do the development very quickly, get a very fast time to market. And it's definitely less expensive. You need less team members. You don't need two separate development teams. So within an organization that's really trying to focus heavily on e-commerce, we're trying to move very quickly to improve our e-commerce foothold. So in that sense, React Native has done very well. We've actually seen quite a bit of growth based on the conversions to React Native that we have done. Because what we were doing before, a lot of our sections were, some of them were native, but most of the ones we converted were web views. And it was just too slow, and the customer experience wasn't good enough. And so just being able to have that real native feel just improved our conversion numbers pretty significantly. So it was really good to see. So
prior to the adoption of React Native, then you mentioned kind of comparing performance to web views. So were a lot of the experiences within the Walmart app previously done as web views within the app?
There are a number of them were. So cart checkout, for example, were web views. And when we were doing performance testing on checkout, for example, we were seeing 6-7 second load times, and it was just painful, and people would be like, you know what, this is just not worth it, and just leaving. But with React Native, it's just much quicker, and we can retain those customers and keep them in the pipeline. So it's worked out.
Okay, great. And Richard, maybe if you can add, I know that we talk about the cart and checkout app, but what are some of the other properties where React Native is in use in production today?
I think Matthew mentioned it. We have like 7. But to bounce back also on this idea of component that you can move across, because we have multi-tenant application inside Walmart, we need to go to a component model. So, and also what we realize is before we engage with React Native, there was a big transformation to move to React on our website. And so we have a large potential of developers with React culture, and that makes it easy to scale our development resource across, not just because it's React Native, but because the architecture, how is it designed now, allow for anything to get plugged in. And we could not have a mono repo, so we had to manage team in India, in New York, and everywhere. So we had to add this platform to create a cement around it. Cement, is it a French word or English? concrete.
Okay. Thanks so much, Richard. So I think, so we generally understand some of the context for, at least how it's being used today. I think, clearly it's seeing a lot of high traffic use cases, and it seems like it has definitely been a benefit to the teams that have adopted it. So maybe we can do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the motivations, and I think we've heard a little bit on that front, but doing a little bit of a deeper dive in some of the other options that you compared, and maybe to kind of kick that off, direct a question to you, Ram, as far as I know that React Native came about before you joined the core team, but if you can explain from what you know of some of the motivations in creating React Native.
So if I have to be honest, React Native is not the first framework that does the way it does things, right? There's Accelerator, there was Titanium. NativeScript is also a pretty good framework. So there have been frameworks out there in the world who have been trying to do this. And this is also something that ties back to my experience at Microsoft, where I was building developer tools, and we had to pick a developer tool that lets people quickly use Visual Studio to prototype and quickly build apps. So back in 2010, we actually chose, so that was much before React Native, and we chose Cordova because it let you build applications and interfaces pretty fast. And Cordova was super popular back then, and this was all even before Ionic started. The big limitation that, as people here probably already know, is performance. It's on the web view, right? So what we really needed, and this is also why React Native started as a hackathon project as Facebook, is that they wanted to have the React model of components, yet they wanted the whole native experience. So like on the Facebook app, you cannot compromise on performance. The number of the classes of devices that people have is very, very varied. There are people who have so we call it device classes. So there's a device class, 2009 device class devices, which are like super slow. On the other side, we have like iPhone X, which is like super fast, and you don't have to worry about like lag and all of that. And I think the reason why we said, hey, let's go do React Native is it let you innovate and prototype much faster. One of the biggest advantages of React Native was you just think about the application, and a lot of the performance optimizations, a lot of this idea of componentization can actually be converted and picked and huddled inside React Native, which again you can actually go prod if you're you can go play around with if your application is starting to hit those limits. So that's how React Native started. So React was super popular. We wanted a componentized model for native app development also. And that was also the time when Facebook had released this infamous or famous post by Zuckerberg saying that HTML5 is bad and should be written for mobile apps, right? So that's when the exploration started. And the fact that, hey, components, plus I want to write it in JavaScript and have that developer cycle. Hit Command-Shift-R and Command-Option-R, and then you want to reload the whole thing, right? You want that. And mobile app, like native app development didn't give you that. So those were like developer efficiency, writing it in JavaScript and componentizing the whole thing, and writing it for multiple platforms at the same time. Those are the three big motivations that led to where we are.
Great. Thank you so much, Ram. So yeah, I guess moving on down the line to Derek then. I guess Ram is done.
I was sitting there and I noticed that you guys have here.
So Derek, tell us a little bit about some of the motivations on the PayPal side for going with React Native, and maybe some of the alternatives that you had explored earlier on.
Sure. So we've explored nearly every single alternative. We really had one baseline requirement that threw a lot of what we could have used out the window, and that was that it had to be some kind of native UI implementation, because as Ram had said, there's just too many problems with web views. Secondly, I don't know if anybody knows what our company does, but we do safe, secure payments for consumers, and web views are not necessarily safe or secure. So we want to move. So we want to move away from those. You can't tell that you're on the PayPal.com website, and we can't really tell you you're on the PayPal.com website. So if you're currently using an app that makes you sign in through a web view, please put feedback for that app maker and let them know that that's an insecure way of serving PayPal. But that was one of our motivations. So we wanted to get users out of using a web view. Part of what makes our corporate brand so strong is that we train U.S. consumers to recognize when you're safe. using PayPal. And so by allowing you to have like a native pay sheet to check out was one of our big motivations. Secondly, one of the big strengths that only a few of these frameworks have, React Native being one, native script, Sear, which you guys haven't heard about yet because it's unannounced. But there are a few of these that actually allow you to do the code push thing. So not all of these dynamic frameworks are runtime frameworks. Some of them are build time. And so it needed to be a runtime such as React Native. And those were the two big takeaways that we needed.
Okay. And in the case of PayPal's adoption of React Native, I mean, presumably it's been the case across most of the companies represented here today that you're starting with a pretty substantial existing code base. So, you know, in none of these cases you were really starting from the ground up with a pure React Native. You know, you were adding it to an existing code
Correct.
base.
So we do have the Talio apps, which were ground up, and those were probably the easiest implementation of doing React Native because they are fully React Native apps, and the only problems that were faced were when those teams were learning React Native, as they had not been React Native developers. We went through the native to React Native pushback that you'll generally get if you're trying to roll this out in your company. Native developers do not want to write in JavaScript. They do not believe that the web is in par with native. So they definitely give a lot of pushback against that. But in terms of actually trying to get it adopted, we are seeing that there are resounding applauses for what React can do. Meeting the Walmart guys and Derek here the first time they actually came in to talk to one of our mobile teams that does our PayPal app that you're very familiar with. And through discussions with this group, you know, they have come to understand that the strengths that we have with React Native versus the opposition that they had before. And they do have our app is completely native today, and we will be hopefully moving towards getting React Native into the official PayPal app as well.
Okay, great. Matt, maybe you can share some of the same insights from the Walmart side as far as cart and checkout and how you came to some of the motivations in choosing React Native.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, we were using all these web views and they were terrible. So I mean, we looked at a couple of different options. We looked at making them native. But you know, cart and checkout is such a massive team. You need a team for Android and iOS. So it's going to cost a lot to build and maintain. A lot of extra developers there. So you know, we were kind of looking at some of the other solutions like Xamarin and React Native. And as Richard mentioned earlier, there was this big push to redo our website in React. So all of our developers already knew React and they knew Redux. So it was just sort of a natural fit for us because if we didn't necessarily need as many native guys, native developers, we could just have, if we needed extra resources, some of the web team can kind of work on React Native because it's something that they're essentially familiar with, switching divs for views, and that just kind of helped make our team a little bit more flexible. So the React Native guys can work a little bit on the web, and the web guys can work a little bit on the mobile app too. So it was sort of just a natural fit for us there.
When you compare some of the different motivations, would you say that is really more of that cross-functional, making teams more cross-functional and having component reuse, or is it more performance, or I guess was there any one motivation that really stood out above the others?
Well, one was the performance. So we knew we had to do something, and the other was there was a part of it was trying to make these teams cross-functional, but when we looked into it and we did our proof of concept and all the native guys were skeptical, but we showed them how quickly that we could develop, how quickly we can get a new product out to market, and so they gave us the green light to go ahead with it. So that's how that came to be.
Great. I guess we understand some of the motivations, but what are some of the challenges that you ran into along the way? I guess starting with you, Matt. We're just going to keep going right into it. Yeah, or Richard. But yeah, I mean, beyond having some of that pushback from native developers.
Yes, yeah, we covered a lot of different challenges along. What? You're gesturing. Anyway, yeah, beyond some of the pushback, there wasn't a whole lot in the way of tools to help us integrate into the native app. I know React Native is good for standalone applications, but we didn't see a whole lot of other big companies kind of integrating React Native into an existing enterprise application. So a lot of what we were doing, we kind of had to engineer ourselves, and Richard and his team did a lot of that work to help us out on that front. So getting this React Native app put in, creating structures on top of the existing bridge to help us communicate with native a little bit better for whatever we needed to do. So, I mean, React Native is pretty good right off the bat, but there's some things that we need extra tools for, and we did end up building a lot of those ourselves. So, I think that was kind of our biggest challenge in developing this initially. So.
Okay. Yeah, and Richard, if you want to expand on, yeah, what are your challenges?
No, but I think it would. What I want to say will be eventually more a question. I would like you guys to give me your perspective. But after nearly 8-9 months helping building these features into the native app, we realized that it's more at the process level. How do you merge two culture? That it's the most difficult because, like you've mentioned, the JavaScript guy doesn't do native don't want to do JavaScript, so you're stuck at this twilight zone where it's very difficult to merge. So I would be interested in knowing how you force, like Mark Zuckerberg gets done, you say you do it, or we're fighting a lot with the process. How do you fill that little gap in between? That's why when we've built a platform, we're trying to automate as much as we can, such that we're left with very small element to fill up. But still, I think that's the most difficult, is joining these two cultures.
So just to throw in real quick, as trying to develop a third-party SDK, I think we hit a big wall, and it needs to be better on the Facebook side because they have deleted the entire page of integrating with a existing application. So it's a 404 now. That's how you integrate, not found. So that was the biggest thing, and the biggest key is that as an Objective-C or iOS or Swift developer, I hardly ever look at my compiling settings, and I have no idea what setting a C-lang compiler flag would necessarily mean, but I'll tell you that it won't let React Native build, right? And so there are like small subtleties within just the build system on an existing application that even seem to be a small barrier to entry.
That's got to be a long answer, but I think, do you want me to answer that, or did...
Go for it.
Okay. So here's the reality. I worked on Cordova, and back in 2010, Cordova did try to do this. It used to be called embedded Cordova. I don't know how many of you remember those. Cordova did try to do this embedded thing where, hey, you can embed Cordova inside an application. It was not super appealing because you could just as well add a web view, right? What extra thing was Cordova bringing in? React Native, on the other hand, prioritizes embedding React Native into a third-party application as one of its primary goals. So if you want to build a standalone app, good, it's already set up very well. However, inside Facebook, our bread and butter is the main Facebook app, right? It's Instagram. Instagram uses React Native at a lot of places. Facebook uses React Native. So integrating, all of our internal apps are the only ones that are fully React Native. Anything that's publicly available is built on a native app integrating into React Native. Having said that, yes, there are problems, and the reason why we had to delete that page was it's unfortunate because honestly it was causing more confusion than not. So the problem is React Native is not a library. You can't just put it up on CocoaPods and say, hey, pick it up and here's how you use it. It's a view manager. It uses Yoga, which is a view layout system, and Yoga has to interoperate very well with your native surfaces. Apart from that, it's also a module system. Yes, you can use CocoaPods, but guess what? React Native has its own set of native modules. If you have, say, a module for a QR code on native, there's no reason why you need to import a second module in React Native to access that module, right? So there are all of these complexities. That's the state of the world today. It is definitely possible, and we do it inside. So we have like a pretty well written process inside Facebook on how all of this works. It's not public out there because it's super coupled with the Facebook infrastructure. I don't know how many of you realize, but Facebook actually has is a company that does mono repos. We do not use Git. There is one repository that's checked out onto my, it's actually 3, but there's one repository that's actually checked out onto my desktop that builds Instagram, Facebook, all the things, all of the apps. And as a result, we wanted development speed, and that's why the priority till now had been, hey, let's just get it all in and ensure that it works for Facebook. Now that we know that it works for Facebook, one of the goals for this half is actually to bring it out and say, hey, here's what, like, I actually love the way you guys did Electrode Native. Like, that's the kind of process we want to bring out. In fact, if Electrode Native, if people have said that, hey, Electrode Native is the way to go, there's no reason why we shouldn't bring that process to be React Native's embedding story. And I mean, yes, React Native started at Facebook, but React is a community project. React Native is a community project, right? So we are definitely looking at what's the best way to do it. And like, long story short, there are problems. Hence, we deleted it because it was only causing confusion. A lot of enterprises wanted to do it, and they just came to us and spoke to us. So it was something that was happening behind the scenes, nothing like really public. And our goal was, hey, let's just be as accessible and try to help people. And our hope is eventually one of those companies will say that, hey, Facebook helped me, and like we've been able to get it done. Why don't we put it out in the React Native documentation? And rather than Facebook writing it, if it's someone like Walmart writing it on the React Native documentation, it would actually be extra proof that, hey, this is not a system that works only for Facebook. It's a system that was inside Facebook, that was super coupled, but Walmart was able to pick it out using something like Electron Native and put it in the React Native documentation. That is good proof that, hey, if you're an independent company like, say, Oracle or SAP or Salesforce, you should be able to just pick it up. Like, I mean, that's where we are headed. So yes, the documentation is not perfect. Yes, the embedding story is not perfect. However, that is one of the big goals that we are looking at fixing in this app.
Fantastic. I think that's great to hear, since that seems to be one of the certainly one of the bigger challenges that
But I also want to add that, so by saying this, I know that I'm probably scaring away a lot of independent developers who want to just write React Native. So that is not going to change. You can still continue writing individual React Native apps. It's just that it's going to get better. That's pretty much it.
Cool. All right. So, I guess, we've heard a little bit about, the challenges at the point of adopting React Native. Can you share a little bit about some of the challenges as you started to scale and really, I guess, scale both adoption internally, but also having applications utilizing React Native and some of the needs that emerge as you get into that situation?
Sure. So. So I found a lot of the challenges initially with our React Native were pretty similar to those encountered as a native developer pushing something to scale. You just got to be really careful with your code. But a code push has been an absolute godsend, because it allows us to it mitigates some of that difficulty, because it allows us to introduce bugs on the fly. So yeah. Correct. What do you mean? That was so, yeah, that's right. But one of the challenges like we've got now is that we've created this ecosystem for React Native at the company, and now we've got seven different teams all doing React Native. And currently we're all kind of using the same bundle, so we're all using the same code push. So, I know the Electro Native team is working on some of this decoupling work, so they can, the different teams within React Native aren't glued together. So, you know, if something is really wrong in one of the apps, one of the versions that get included in the bundle, it's not going to bring down the entire site. So that's definitely a challenge. And Richard can speak more a little about that if that.
Yeah, that's one of the largest problem that came back from everybody is the fact that Code Push only use one bundle. So we're kind of experimenting now, trying to go to a multi-bundle distribution. Hey? Krunal, sorry, your project is killed. Or we move to Facebook. So thank you, sir. Yeah. Let me your phone number, I'll call you. Yeah, multi-bundle, because people wants to run in isolation. They don't want their feature to possibly impact. And also we've tried to develop something interesting as, you know, because there's OTA and there's JavaScript, we have invented this concept of headless React Native component where we don't use UI. We use it more as implementing business logic to talk to the backend, since we're dealing with Swagger schema in how we build the mobile integration. We also deal with the same schema for the backend. So we see a perfect match for people to write business logic component that move across without any UI, but using React Native and running in another VM or something like that. So there's a lot of possibility even if you're not doing UI.
Absolutely. What are some of the, you know, I guess prior to introducing Electrode Native, which we'll get into shortly, what were some of the challenges, I guess, what kinds of challenges emerged as far as managing things like dependencies, or necessarily even enforcing the same practices across teams, since, you know, like React Native is also a very unopinionated
dependencies
framework.
in terms of people or group or technology?
In terms of across teams, so essentially enforcing the same modules, same practices. You know, is that a challenge that you encountered before Electrode Native?
We're trying not only to deploy a platform that, but we're also building some kind of native base module, such that, again, our goal is to make very simple integration. So we're trying to hide as much complexity as possible. So we're building native component that distribute with the platform, and we customize these architecture for each app. So that simplifies a lot, because yes, there's a cost of entry, and we're trying to reduce it as much as possible. I had something else to say, but I forgot. So.
All right.
Who's next?
Yeah, go for
I
it.
don't know if the rhythm is anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah. So, yeah.
What question am I answering?
So the topic still is challenges at scale. So within PayPal, what kinds of challenges
Sure.
do you see?
So I don't even know if it's within PayPal, but even just the velocity of the React Native project is. Sorry, I'm harping on you. We aren't even at that part yet. No. So the velocity of the React Native project itself made it really hard to keep up with the open source community's version of those modules. Without something like Electrode Native, which is actually doing this perusing for you and ensuring that the modules are matching which React Native version you have, that was probably our biggest challenge. Is after we would bring in more developers on staff, everybody wants to upgrade modules or switch modules or shift away from what you were using, and pretty soon trying to move from React Native 45 to 46 when there's a deprecation, just makes life really hard. But after using tools like Electrode Native, and I don't know that there's a ton of other tooling that's coming out. So really, thank you, Walmart, for creating some of the best tooling around React Native. it's created the ability to manage module dependencies, and I think the community is getting much better at recognizing which JavaScript and native modules they're writing would go against which version of React Native, and making sure to spell that out explicitly. But I'd still like to see something within the React Native ecosystem that identifies itself verbosely while you're running inside of it, and modules that are running on it, so that you don't have to make assumptions at build time and hope that everything is there, but that you could react at runtime to things that might be missing or are not accurate.
Yeah, in the platform we wrote this tool called Cauldron that help you have a discussion around dependency. Even in the native world before, dealing with dependency and versioning was complicated. Adding a second different world is even more complicated. So we build a tool that allows for us to understand all the native dependencies, all the version of the app out there, and can direct people and how they can push the code to which version of the app. Maybe I'll ask you a last thing. One of our greatest difficulties is the versioning of native library like OK HTTP.
So I think the question, just to reiterate the question so that I don't forget it, is what are the challenges with React Native? Oh boy. So let me break that down into two sets. Challenges that I've heard from independent developers. I do understand that a lot of you are not enterprises. You do not have the luxury of, how many of you are startup or like in a team of like 5 or 10 people? There still are people. So I think there are the set of challenges that set of developers have is a little bit different. The set of challenges that enterprises have are different. So let me try to address both of them. So as far as independent developers are concerned, or in fact, this is true for both cases, the speed at which React Native upgrades, that's crazy. I think that's not a problem, that's a strength. The issue, however, is keeping up with it is hard. And why is it hard? Like, what happens really when you try to upgrade? The fact that React Native right now is a monolith. There is no reason for scroll view, flat list to actually be inside React Native, right? So one of the efforts that the Expo guys and us, Facebook, we are looking at is breaking React Native repository and trying to reduce the surface area. So maybe you might see a React Native that's super simple, just a bridge, just JSC bindings, and a few, like all the bridge views, just the UI manager, and maybe view text and image. Everything else is maybe pushed out to like a separate repository. What that will give you is when you upgrade React Native core, it's super tiny. And then you can go pick up whatever other dependency that you want. And the reason why I believe that this will work is we did a survey of breaking changes over the last 2 years. And there have been only 2 instances where React Native core had to change. The first one was when iOS headers had moved. And the second one is something to do with Android, which I'm not able to recollect. Every other change has been, hey, this text input seems to add this new property, or it changed the behavior of a separate prop, or its behavior change. So there's no reason why we want to keep all of that as a part of React Native core. By doing that, we'll also be able to help people like PayPal who are building an SDK, because they don't need a scroll view because they're not probably going to use it. This will let you import all of these as and when you require. The model that we are looking at is what Create React App did for the whole React ecosystem. You know how Create React App brings all of this together and then gives you one bundle to consume, but then you can eject out and just throw off stuff that you don't want? That model has worked very well for React. And we want to emulate something similar for the React Native world. So that's the first challenge. And to your question, the secret password is React Native unbundle. So there's a command called React Native unbundle today, which lets you split bundles, and you can use it with code push. And the way you would do it is when you're asking for a bundle, you tell the code push server that, hey, this is the native version I have. And if you unbundle it, you can actually get like multiple, the whole big bundle is broken down, and you would get the JavaScript that works for your app. And it exists today, and it works with code push today.
Does it run in isolation? When all the pieces of the bundles are there.
So React 16 has error boundaries. So you use that with unbundle, and you will be able to make, like, you'll be able to get to a very good, you will be able to cover a lot of distance. The second thing is, the second question was, in general, how do companies, if you're using code push, let's say you have native app version 1, 2, and 3 that have some native code change. That goes out every 2 weeks thanks to Apple's review policy, or that goes out every 24 hours. On the other hand, you have code push updates that go, like Facebook actually does over-the-air update, and we do it like 4 hours, 6 hours. So every 4 hours or 6 hours, you get a new version of the app. How do you ensure that a specific function that JavaScript is using is in the native bundle that has shipped, say, 2 weeks before? So that's basically the crux of the problem. Different companies solve it differently. All of the solutions, however, are tending towards or are similar to what Cauldron does. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Airbnb, Leland actually has a pretty interesting way to solve it. The way they do it is, before they call an API from JavaScript, they check if the native code has that API or not. It's similar to Android permission model if you've used it, but it does incur a runtime cost. You have to check before calling. So that's the negative, but there is a way to do that. The other thing that we do is we are always on the latest, and the way we generate our native code is we don't write, if you look at the React Native guides, there's this guide to write native modules. We don't use that. We actually have a script that generates what it outputs. So we write a JavaScript file which is completely which has flow definitions. That flow types are picked up and native code is generated for that. And guess what? Objective-C is strongly typed, Java is strongly typed, you can just generate it. Peggy actually wrote an open source, Peggy Rices, who's now at Apollo. She actually wrote, at Chain React, she released a library that does something similar. At Microsoft, we had TypeScript, similar story. So all the big companies have come up with a way that does similar to, hey, JavaScript does check it. It's just that there's no one single winner out there. So that's the problem. So that's another problem for big companies. The third and the most common thing that I hear that seems to trip up all the people who just get started with React Native is navigation. How many of you here have had navigation problems, React navigation? So there are so many libraries, right? What do you pick up? Do you pick up React navigation that Facebook started and now Expo maintaining? Do you pick up Wix navigation? Do you pick up Airbnb's now abandoned navigation? There are so many solutions. So I think the story is we are also working on a singular navigation API. So I spoke to Wix, I spoke to guys at Wix, I spoke to guys who are doing React navigation, and we want to see if we can unify the API so that, you know how in animation you switch and just say use native driver true? We want to do something similar for navigation also. It's say, hey, I want native navigation, or I just don't want native navigation. If you use native navigation, you'll have certain limitations, but that's pretty much it. The final problem that I want to talk about is if you want to use a QR code reader in React Native, what library do you use? I don't know if it's a problem or not because you have 10 choices. Like there are frameworks that have 0 options and you have to go write your own. React Native is opposite. You have 10 choices, you have no idea if it's good or not. So the way like even internally at Facebook, we want to use a functionality. Because we have a mono repo, we have to go figure out, hey, who gives this functionality? So what we are going to start looking at is finding a way in which we can say, hey, here's how you would write test cases or screenshot tests, as you may want to call it, to ensure that these third-party native modules are up to date with the latest version of React. So using peer dependencies, using NPM dependencies, we may be able to enforce that. We haven't like really looked into what exactly the semantics are, but that's also another problem that we're actively looking at because yes, people are hitting that issue.
All right. Well, cool. And I think it's interesting hearing where things are headed. It's clear that there are a lot of improvements on the way, and it seems like the team is actively listening and hearing about some of these challenges are popping up, and hopefully life will become a little easier for folks as time goes on. So it's an exciting time. So I guess kind of wrapping things out with the final theme for this evening. We've heard a little bit about kind of what's on the horizon on the Facebook side, but we'd love to hear from both PayPal and Walmart as far as some of the solutions that they've built along the way, or expanding on a little bit more on some of what they touched on earlier. So maybe we can start with Richard, actually, to tell us a little bit more about the effort at Walmart.
The future, our future.
Yes.
I mean, we're in a period now. We're more in a consolidation, where our VP came out and said to all the native guy, you're useless, web will replace you. Then they send me talk to this guy. It was not a fun job. And now we're in peace all together. So we're more in the consolidation where we're trying to make sure that, the entire infrastructure, that means code push, generating container, cauldron, all of these tools are set up correctly for every team to work on. And what we're trying to solve now is more like the multi-bundle thing, reducing the size of code push by going into a differential code push type of thing where assets are managed differently. Navigation, so invite us please, because Claire, take note. We're fighting with navigation between native and React and React and React and native back. And finally, I think it's secret. We're supposed to come with kind of a new stuff, and that involve a lot of visual change. So building component that are able to be in sync with native, like Android has his way of doing assets and colors, and iOS. So we're trying to find a common ground where if there's a large UI change across the entire app, that our component can react correctly to this change, and consolidation. So for now, we're not looking at building new stuff, but more making sure the process is well defined and the collaboration works across all of our different applications.
I'm not sure if you actually had a chance to formally introduce kind of Walmart's solution. I know you kind of touched on it a little bit at various points, but maybe you could share a little bit more about what exactly Electrode Native is and kind of how that came into play.
I mean, so when we started developing this, one thing that was very important for us is that we would not impact the React Native developer. We should not impose any constraint in the way they work. So what we've built is first a way to open a discussion between native and JavaScript developer through expliciting the contract, because some functionality exists on the native side, some others will appear on the JavaScript side. So first we had to manage that discussion. How do we come with a contract and get the native guy to implement it? So we've based our first implementation on Swagger because it's being used a lot. So the React Native guy will figure out their Swagger schema with what they need. We'll then build what we call a container that will contain all of the generated code for Android, iOS, and JavaScript with a common interface. So a native guy calling us or responding to a response from us will just see Android code or Swift code. We also extended the support for primitive, so we support complex object models, so you can define a card, a payment, a credit card, and we'll generate all of the code, the plumbing code that allows serialization, deserialization across boundary. Going down the pipe. Yeah, that's pretty much it, I think. Did I forget something? No, it's good. Yeah. So that's where we're working, and making sure that each world doesn't have to really understand the other world, and building as much as we can. So it's that was the mission of our platform.
Okay, great. If there's anything specific aside from what Richard touched on already, Matt, within your team, or if it's largely an Electrode Native team effort?
Well, it's a bit of, obviously that we have, various features in cart and checkout that we're doing, but I think right now the main thing that we're trying to focus on is we do have all these disparate teams using React Native, and so we're trying to work closely with Richard's team and all these other teams, trying to establish process by which we can all work together in harmony, and rather than trying to stepping on each other's toes. And so far it's been a little challenging. We have one of those teams that are in India, and one of the teams in Portland, and so it's just very tricky. So we're just trying to establish standards, and since my team was the first ones to use React Native, everyone kind of comes to us for how do we do this, how do we implement this feature or that, what's the best way to go about working with Richard's team and integrating, and so a lot of our time is kind of spent doing that. So, but we'll figure it out, and we'll get some more stuff with Electrode Native, and I'm sure that's pretty soon we'll start pumping out more apps. So
great. Yeah, Derek, how about your team? What kinds of it sounds like you've done a lot of work also in building out some some various components and
Absolutely.
And some of, things
so
along the way as well.
we've done the code push thing before there were open source alternatives, or even Microsoft had stood up the beginning of their server, which wasn't it had one thing. It pushed you out a JavaScript bundle, and that's all it did. So we thought we could build something that had more rules around it before they got to it. Obviously, code push is very mature now, and it does a lot more than that. One thing that we ran into, and this is more of a limitation, not necessarily of React, but of how C apps and iOS apps build themselves, is that as a third-party SDK, we run into a lot of collision, especially with enums and structs. C has no namespace concept at all. So, the tried and true way is to use control, find, and replace every instance of some kind of acronym that's at the beginning of all of your classes. PYPL, for instance, I don't know, WMR?
You have seen RCT,
RCT,
everything,
yep, all of those. So you might want to cover your ears. We have started standing up a superset of the React Native API with a completely different implementation around it. So we are big believers that React is the API of the future, that we believe that React has really hit on the fact that its contract is widely accepted. A lot of people have put in time into finessing React. It wasn't always like this. So before ES6, React was very ugly. It had its own conventions, and it did make opinions about how you should do something, even though it was not opinionated about how you put that together. As ES6 and we have Webpack and a lot of these transpilation tools have really seen the explosion of ES6 classes being accepted, and now React has internalized that as a pattern, and so we saw no reason to step away from that API. What we did do is we started to, and this will be great to know that React Native itself is going to start whittling down its surface area, because that was the one thing that we needed to attack. We stripped out as much React Native code before we shipped our SDK as we possibly could, and it was still like 5 megabytes in terms of like an integration. And that sounds really small, but if you're already pushing an application that's hit Apple's I think they raised it to 100 megabytes, but back when we started it was like 75 megabytes. Once you hit that threshold, you have to offer the user a secondary download. If they're on cellular, they can no longer download your app without using Wi-Fi or using the secondary download. So it becomes like a contention point, basically, with our integration as a third-party SDK. So we've seen the minimum React Native size be around 4 megabytes, and by whittling out everything that's in between, we still have eventing, animations. We stole a lot of the code from React, borrowed a lot of the code from the open source MIT implementation of React Native, and we've brought it down somewhere to around 750 kilobytes worth of compiled code. We have made some trade-offs, though, so we do not ship a JSC because it's 2018 and we're not starting when React Native did. So we're leaning heavily on WebKit, for instance, which does JIT and off-process compilation. There are obviously some startup implications around that and some memory implications, but they're trade-offs that we've decided to take to ensure that we can ship a minimal SDK using a lot of the exact same technology. So it's not one for one. We don't have Yoga, which is amazing. We could bring that in. but then it's all written in C, so it puts us back to where we were. So we don't have like really great layout libraries, but we have implemented, if you go to the React Native documentation, if it's on that documentation, we've tried to contract that API and re-implement.
Great. I think
It's at syr.js.org if anybody wants to look at unfinished code, but our iOS implementation, is almost finished. It is a web-first library, so it renders in both iOS, Android, and the web without any changes to your code.
very impressive.
syr.js.org.
You got it. If anybody wants to know the namesake, Seer is the stitching goddess. Freya is boar, so Seer, SYR.
All right. Ram, did you want to close us out with any, as you already touched on a fair number of things that are sort of on solutions that you've built along the way and things that are on the radar. Is there anything final you wanted to add?
So I think the number of technical things that we can talk about are like infinite. There are so many possibilities with React Native. I think one of the things I do want to emphasize is we want to ensure that React Native is an open, diverse, and inclusive community. We want to be welcoming welcoming to everyone. And given that there are so many companies doing React Native, I think it's very, very useful if you swap notes. If you are starting, either if you're starting React Native or even if you're a big company who's looking to do React Native, one good resource would be to come talk to people during React Wednesdays. So I don't know how many of you know React Wednesdays, but it's like it's hosted by PayPal, Uber, like the last one was hosted by Pinterest. It's a place where all of these companies come together, sit for the whole of Wednesday, and swap notes. 2 React Wednesdays back, we were speaking about navigation. Before that, the one before that was at Facebook, and we were talking about breaking down the React library. So I think if you are getting started with React Native and want to come talk tech, all the people who are working or using React Native are like very, very friendly. Come talk to us. We would love to help you. And it's not just Facebook. I mean, if you do not want to talk to Facebook, sure, you can always go talk to Airbnb. There's Uber, there's Pinterest, there's Yelp, there's Apollo. I'm not even naming all the companies. So that's actually a very good forum. And I think I want to finish off with this meta point, primarily because we cannot cover every single question that you have here. So if you have questions, I'm also going to be hanging around here, but you can either come talk to me or come to React Wednesdays, and people would love to chat.
Great.
Just to throw out, if you're looking for React Wednesdays, it's a closed Facebook group because obviously Facebook's React makes sense to put it on Facebook. So use your Facebook account, find React Wednesdays, just send a join request and somebody will authorize you. We're not gating. We don't want to keep people out we don't know. Just that we don't want anybody just to willy-nilly join. So.
Okay, great. All right, and that about wraps up our formal curated list of themes for this evening. So we're going to continue into audience Q&A now. I guess, yeah.
No, I got somebody. Siddharth, come get this mic, please. Everybody, this is Siddharth. He's on my team. He works on native checkout.
This question is for Ram from Facebook, not Ram from CodePush. So you mentioned that Facebook internally has an module auto-generate way, like some magic sauce, and also more dependency resolution and how to add modules into existing native apps. So why React Native has existed for about a couple of years now, a little more than a couple of years. Why has it not yet made into open source? Number one. Second question is probably very related to my first question. How does Facebook work with respect to open source? Do you have like a dedicated team that works on React Native and that is consumed by an ads team that's generating the product work, or how does it work?
That's actually a pretty good question, and I think, so let me answer the first part of the question. So why is it not yet open source? Honestly, we have just not had the time. We would love to open source it. Again, it's so coupled with our infrastructure that we have not just had the time. And there are people who have done it outside. Like there are so many other solutions. It's not that what we have done is magic. It's super simple. All we see is write your JavaScript file. Because it has flow types, you just generate Java code for it. So auto-generating code is not that hard, and we will definitely want to open source it. We just haven't had the time. in fact, if you want to do it, it's easier for you to write it than for you to wait for Facebook to open source it and then consume it. It's not that hard. Though it sounds cool, it's not that cool really. Like it's something that had to be done, and we just did it. And if you notice, like the proof is Airbnb does it. Like so many other people do it, right? So it's something that should have been done. Unfortunately, it didn't get done. I'm hoping that someone in the community actually steps up and gets it done. It's simple. The second question: what is the team composition like? So we do have an open source team, and they're the people who are responsible for all the bots and all the approval bots and all of that. They take care of the general open source infrastructure. They just released this thing called Docusaurus, on which our documentation is. But the React Native team itself, right now most of our attention is towards ensuring that we serve the needs of Facebook. So the way, if you look at the way the code flows, is it gets checked into our repository first, and then it flows into GitHub. That's not the most ideal. I personally like the way the React team does. What the React team does is, and they're probably the only team at Facebook that does this, they check in code into GitHub first, and then from GitHub it flows into React repository. I'm hoping that React Native starts to follow this model. We are not there yet by any means. React's model has been super successful. It has actually increased the number of contributions. The community is much, much bigger. And also, again, React Native has been around longer than React. React has been around longer than React Native. So the short answer is, I love the React model. I hope we get there someday, but right now we are not there yet. It's just that there are so many things to do, and the team is 8, 9 people. So.
Hi, Ram. This is a question for you again. So this is in regards to the 64-bit support, and it's 64-bit support for Android. Android Play Store has enforced all the apps to be also having a 64-bit architecture support on Play Store. And for supposedly there is a React Native when they integrate with the third-party libraries. There is always kind of a problem with the SO library. Bug's been open for over 2.5 years now. So usually if it's that critical issue, so many people watching it, there has not been much of Facebook activity. Just wanted to see where that's going.
So that's also one of our failings. PRs that have been around for more than 2 years, we should have closed it. It's like no excuses. We are to blame. We want to fix it, but we are not able to find the capacity, unfortunately, right? That's why I'm hoping that by slimming down the React Native repository, we will be able to encourage more people to come in as contributors. So the Expo folks have been doing an amazing job. People from CallStack.io, Mike has been doing an amazing job releasing. I'm actually hoping that more and more people from outside come in and have the authority and knowledge to accept these PRs. We have fixed it internally at Facebook, but again, because it's a part of the Facebook infrastructure, the PR is a little bit different from the way we have solved it. So there's no incentive that, hey, we have to go fix this immediately because it breaks us. And I mean, that's how open source works, right? So the more easy we make for people to contribute, the more people contribute and fix these kind of issues. So I think the meta point there is why are React Native PRs pending for two plus years? Yes, that's a problem. Let's solve it as a community. I mean, I don't think we should wait for Facebook to come in and solve the problems for us. Let's solve it as a community, and that's probably the best way to do it. So that's a 2009. So yes, we are going to get there. And now that we have a deadline, we are going to have to solve it, right? So yes, we will get it done. Like it's honestly, if something is not on fire, it doesn't catch our attention because there are so many things, right?
This question is like for all of you, I guess. I'm wondering if you use just straight up JavaScript or you use a strongly typed language like TypeScript or Flow around that. And the side question to that is, how do you ensure the contract between the API and the client are matching and avoiding exceptions in missed attributes in the data models and stuff?
So So you might not like my answer, but we just use regular JavaScript. Ouch. We're big fans of just using regular JavaScript. So it's not that we're against Flow or any of the TypeScript or any of the other modifications that you could use. We just really like using raw JavaScript. React Native does a really good job at taking care of type checks for you as well when it does a lot of the stuff across the bridge. So if you're throwing it the wrong type while you're developing, you'll definitely get visual cues back for that. What was the second part of the question? Ensuring the contract. So that's something that we're currently struggling with ourselves, and we've been leaning on things like Electrode Native to ensure that our modules are matching. We have preprocessors that go through our Objective-C code, and they inline which versions of React Native we're using, which versions of all the modules we're using, and then we actually check those on startup with our app. So we have a dual process, basically, is we parse all of this Objective-C or all of this Java, and we inline all of these constants, and then we also do the same thing with our JavaScript, and then we do a startup check to ensure that that JavaScript is matching the contract that it would be running under.
So we use a little bit of Flow. Like we haven't put it all over the place. We were kind of lazy on that, honestly. But yes, more important things. There were things on fire. Yeah, it can definitely be a problem. Electronative does a lot of that for us. We're pretty comfortable with whatever we're going to get from at least our backends or from some of the native APIs, and we also we do a fair amount of safety checking too, just in case. But we generally know what we're going to get most of the time, so that's quite helpful. No.
We use Flow at Facebook. We used to use TypeScript at Microsoft. But that doesn't mean, so while it's great to use, remember that there's a tax that comes if you start using Flow and TypeScript. Like it's definitely extra dev time. It saves you a lot of time, but depending on your team size and your requirements, I would say there's no right answer. It's not that you have to go use Flow and TypeScript. It's basically what your team needs, right?
So I have two questions, one for Ram and one for Derek. So for Ram, so you mentioned kind of heavy kind of coupling with your infrastructure at Facebook. Richard mentioned OKHTTP as well, issue like, so I've seen at some point for the upgrade of OKHTTP version, it was like, well, it's tightly coupled with our infrastructure at Facebook, so we cannot really upgrade OKHTTP at this time. So in terms of decoupling from your, decoupling React Native from your infrastructure, is it something that some initiative are taken there? Like, for example, OKHTTP, it's directly consumed, it's directly coupled with React Native, whereas if you had kind of an interface and let different implementation or even existing implementation so that anyone could use its own OKHTTP version. So it's more in terms of integrating with existing native application, obviously, because for a pure React Native application, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, in terms of decoupling, and if it's not done internally by the core team, as you mentioned, PR can take a long time, and especially for that, if you were to hide everything behind an interface and offer different implementation, it would obviously be a big pull request. Is there any kind of fast lane for doing that in collaboration with Facebook for big initiative like that? Or, yeah.
So the short answer is yes, there's a fast lane. Come talk to me. Like that's probably the simplest. I mean, given that there are so many PRs, it's been hard again to like just look at every single one of them. Easiest is to just come talk to us, and you can get it done. Like there's no reason why we want to get it. But the longer term answer is OKHTTP again is just one example. There's no reason why OKHTTP actually needs to be inside React Native Core. And that's why what we are doing is we are trying to say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's cut down React Native surface area as much as possible. And one of the cullings would actually be OKHTTP. Like OKHTTP might actually go out. Who uses OKHTTP? The fetch module, the WebSocket module, right? What if they're not a part of React Native Core? You would be able to pick up your own fetch module and your own WebSocket module. And that way, this problem will not even exist.
Yeah, so, well, for the debugging bridge, this kind of thing like WebSocket module, like you mentioned, it's...
So, again...
So you need to provide a default implementation somehow anyways.
No, we just worry about a WebSocket a WebSocket interface. Honestly, so I also wrote the Visual Studio VS Code React Native debugger. It does not use OKHTTP. It actually uses NPM's WebSocket module. So there is a way to replace it.
Okay.
So
Yeah, we
it
should talk
doesn't
more.
say that you have to use OKHTTP. I think short term, if you want to get it done, let's just chat and get it done. It's easier.
Right.
Long term, let's actually do it the right way, which is cutting it short, cutting it and ensuring that each of it is a part and people can go mix and match as they want.
Okay, thank you. And for Derek, so you mentioned like the web views lack of security in some ways, but JavaScript modules are not bulletproof as well. So like there was, I mean, obviously when you're building a JavaScript app, you're pulling in a lot and a lot of JavaScript modules, and some of them might be malicious. So are you using any kind of tooling to check your module security?
So here at PayPal, we have an ingenious security platform group that actually scans every single Node app that we build internally. And they give us security checks across all of our applications. Second to that is we run an internal NPM registry, and we don't actually pull from the main registry. And so our security group will blacklist and block us from installing any modules then that have been blacklisted. So that it doesn't cover everything because they're definitely not proofreading every single bit of source code that goes out there, but it stops us from grabbing a lot of malicious potential apps. Secondly, what we do with our experience is that because it's not on a controlled environment such as a web page, it actually gets a need to know information and it doesn't actually get your account information. So the experience that we're exposing literally only knows a token for your identity to check out on your behalf. And it knows the last 4 digits of some credit cards that are in your wallet, as well as a shipping address. And that's all we provide through this interface to ensure then that everything is as secure as possible. If you're doing any other actions, then we force you to bump out into a Safari view controller or a Chrome custom tab where we can not necessarily just own all that code, because we still have the same problem where we're probably running NPM JavaScript on there, but that we can own and restrict calls that are coming out of the code and cross-origin and all of that good security stuff that's built directly into the browser rather than leaving it unexposed through like React's native's transport bridge, for example.
Yeah, this is a question for PayPal and Walmart. Like when you are evaluating alternatives to React Native, specifically with native script, what did you find that will not work for you? Because we were thinking between React Native and native script, and specifically for a Angular shop who doesn't have like existing React components. So will it be easier to move to native script as compared to React Native?
So it's not that native script is bad. It's that personally, in the opinion that Angular is maybe on the way out in terms of a development paradigm. So it's much easier to reach into an ecosystem of people who are now familiar with React Web and React growing. We have Preact. We have a bunch of different stand-ups that are going against the React API versus an Angular API, for instance. So it wasn't that we had any apprehension towards using something like native script. It was just that we really wanted to stick with the classic ES6 syntax. So if React had been at a point where maybe it was opinionated about its pattern, we could have probably chosen a different thing because we weren't really keen on the original React pattern. But now that it's really just open JavaScript, it makes a lot more sense for us to continue in the ecosystem. And we kind of saw the same thing with common JS format versus import structure for a while. Once we made the switch, people were reluctant to give up common JS because it had worked. It's what we were used to. And now we're slowly seeing a huge gradual shift to everybody wanting to use named imports, for example. We just think that eventually that pattern will supersede the other patterns that are out there. We don't feel that it's flavor of the week, that it's a long-lasting pattern that the community has grabbed onto, but JavaScript developers as well.
Sure. Thank you.
So we didn't actually look at native script, but as Derek kind of touched on, everyone was just kind of familiar at the company was familiar with the React paradigm, so it was just sort of a very natural fit for us there.
I know you didn't ask me this question, but I think that I have to answer that, given that I spent like 1 week evaluating both of these technologies. So yes, I think the biggest reason is going to be the React versus Angular story. However, that's not going to be my answer, because like you've heard more than enough from like the expert. What I did do was look into the internal details of NativeScript and React Native and try to figure out what does what. So here are some of the things I found. I like React's, you know the bridge, right? The bridge between JavaScript to native. I personally like the way React does the communication, which is batched and synchronous. And with React Fiber coming in, we also, like, it's batched and async right now, but we also want batched and sync, right? Or just sync. So I think that's one advantage, or one paradigm model that React can provide, with React Native can provide, that NativeScript may not be able to with the current way Angular is written. The second thing is, I love the fact that NativeScript has the idea of you can write native modules in JavaScript. So they basically reflect all of their API over to JavaScript, right? So that's awesome. React Native does not have that. You have to go fish for modules. The downside, you cannot, like, there's no simple way to write a native module in NativeScript. If you already have an existing Java SDK, wrapping it in NativeScript is a little bit hard. And I think the third big thing that did stand out to me is community support. Like, number of people using React Native versus number of people using NativeScript.
I had a question about JavaScript core. Two questions. One for Ram and one for Derek. So, what? You know what's coming?
No, go on.
Okay. All right. So the JavaScript core that ships for React Native Android is from 2014. Results in a lot of bundle bloat from polyfills and nonsense. Expo and Software Mansion have upgraded JavaScript core to great effect to specifically improve performance on lower-end Android devices where the I/O and the bundle size and everything else. And it affects other devices as well, but it affects those lower-end devices that are so much more common in, I guess, what we could call emerging markets, whatever phrase you would want to use for the places where those 2010 kind of Android phones that are $1 are really common. So what is the timeline for Facebook to update that? And so that's the first question for Ram. And then since Expo has already done it, is already shipping it with their SDK, and it just looks bizarre that Facebook isn't doing the same thing and serving the non-Expo community in the same way. And then the other question I have is, as far as like using a JavaScript core or any JavaScript runtime that uses a JIT, what I found with Chakra Core JSC, Chakra Core, JavaScript Core, and V8 is it adds 200 milliseconds to time to interaction. How are you offsetting that? Are you profile optimizing well, you're not profile optimizing it because you're using the system installed one. So do you just eat it and let the users like suffer and have a worse experience, or how are you solving that?
Regarding the JSC, let's just get what Expo is using. I mean, honestly, Facebook doesn't care about the JSC implementation yet as much. So we do our own stuff, kind of thing. So we should just get in what Christoph and the Software Mansion guys have done. Like, there's no reason why we need to keep it out. I think there's also a Slack discussion where folks from Facebook did talk about like the dynamics of it. The reason I'm a little bit like beating around the bush is because there are things that I may not be able to reveal. I mean, it's unfortunately it's confidential, patent, blah blah blah. But let's get what Expo has written. I think that's the right thing to do. In the open source community, we should not have to wait for, like, yes, the JSC is old. Let's actually get the latest JSC that is inside. Like that I think that's the official answer. I mean, that's the official answer. And I think to your question about Chakra Core, so I was at Microsoft, right? And I did speak to Gaurav and the Chakra Core folks, and when I was talking to them, they did not, like, one of the things that they did evaluate was, hey, do you want to make Chakra Core run on Android? And didn't look like that was on their priority list. JSC is fastest because of what is that thing called, the pre-compile thing that you can load. I forgot the name. Snapshots, V8 snapshots, right? So JSC, like I think the Expo guys were playing around with JSC having VM the JavaScript snapshots loaded somehow. I'm not sure how far the project went.
Not far? No.
There you go. But I think NativeScript runs on V8, and they I think use V8 snapshots to make their startup time faster. We are trying to solve it in our own way. I don't know if we have an answer in the open source way of doing things. I mean, I'm sorry this is beating around the bush and I don't have a clear answer, but.
Okay, so to get to your second question, then, so the paradigm that we are creating is specifically focused at shared experience developers or SDK developers. So in our instance, the boot up process being warm right away doesn't necessarily affect us, especially for a PayPal checkout. The user is unlikely to ever see checkout as the first page when they hit their app and then go through an actual checkout flow, which gives us enough time to actually boot up a hidden web browser and actually bring up like the WebKit engine and have it at rest. Secondly, if you're looking at a platform like Android, just to bring the JSC alone, you're looking at double digits of expanding your APK size just to get the JSC. Right, but you know, up front, that's not a cost that. So when we work with developers, we're not necessarily working with a development house that's concerned about the end result. So we usually typically get media market or third-party developers that are developing for an app house, and their first thing is let's get everything put together and pushed out. And so upfront, looking at the cost, it looks apprehensive to them, especially if they don't know about profiling, code splitting, and so forth. So we found that the trade-offs of using that like 200 milliseconds, so it's definitely noticeable if you're booting up an application and the splash screen sticks for 200 milliseconds, but it's unnoticeable if you're actually using it in a scenario where you pull out your Walmart app and it has PayPal integrated and you check out through PayPal. We would have already booted up the experience and been resting by then. Exactly. Yep. So we're just sitting in the background, and then unfortunately, the way that the WK WebView classes are written, you cannot separate them into a background process if the foreground process is using the class at all. So originally, we had tried to offload all of it into the background, but as soon as a developer is using a WK WebView in the foreground, the class does not actually have separate sandboxes for both threads.
And I think in that specific case, we believe that it's not the JavaScript engine that's taking up time, but it's the fact that the communication is async. So if we were able to, like, Fiber lets you kind of parallelize that communication. So we haven't really, if you notice, we haven't taken advantage of Fiber sync at all in React Native, right? So I personally believe that the amount of gains we will have by ignoring the yes, there's going to be benefit of having a better JavaScript engine, but the amount of benefit that we will get by having a much more synchronous bridge and improving the bridge will be much higher than fixing JSC is hard. Fixing React's batch mechanism is actually easier. And we are experimenting with, we haven't used Fiber, right? So we are experimenting with a bunch of rendering mechanism, changing the UI manager to see if we can block and render on the main thread. And there are experiments that we're playing around with to figure out what can be done.
I think this will be the last question of the evening before we close out.
I have a question for Walmart and for Facebook. It's basically when building mobile apps to serve iOS and Android and also web, how much React Native are you using and how much customization do you use? So for Instagram's case, when serving web and iOS, is Swift being used extensively in addition to React Native?
If Swiss, I didn't get the question correctly. We're a Swift shop. I don't think there's a lot of Objective-C left around. I know the grocery app is totally Swift, and I think in the Walmart app there's still some Objective-C, but we're mainly on iOS Swift. That was the question?
Do you use Swift and React, like your Swagger API?
Yeah. We generate all the Swift code that connect both worlds. So our generator are Swift. No, I didn't get the question right yet. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
So this is an interesting question in Facebook because there are two groups, two schools of thought. One believe that Swift is awesome. The other believe that Swift is horrible. So the problem comes down to the fact that Swift tooling is kind of bloated. We want to keep the size down. There's already a pretty well built up infrastructure and tooling for Objective-C. So there's a lot of code with React Native and Swift, React Native and Objective-C. People have tried React Native and Swift. We haven't had Instagram or apps using as much of React Native and Swift. So Objective-C is definitely like 90-95% prevalent. There have been experiments with Swift, but nothing large scale that I can think of.
All right, so I think that about wraps up our Q&A for this evening. All right. Well, it's been great having everybody here this evening. I just want to close things out really quickly and thank everybody on our panel. It's been great having them all. And again, just want to do a quick thank you again especially to PayPal for hosting us this evening, and to everybody else that contributed to the event this evening. Just one final note, again, as a mission of trying to build more of a community around React Native in production, anybody who is interested in being part of this and continuing to carry this forward, please do come and talk to any of us wearing the white shirts afterward. And just one final thing, anybody that is interested in education, mentoring around React and React Native, we would also love to talk to you. So with that, have a good rest of your evening, and please finish off the pizza out there.